What is the strangest unsolved mystery? There are many theories why it's the ice mummy, man from the ice, that died in 3200 BC in the glaciers of what is now Tyrol in Austria, was murdered. The cause of death was a shot to the back with an arrow, but there are many things that don't make sense. Like some people think it was his own hunting party that killed him, because his stomach showed a big meal that someone would not be able to make when he'd be on the run. Still, the analysis shows that he tried to evade some pursuers. He got up and down in the mountains. He was in a melee fight not long before his death. There are many more things, like the murderers left his very valuable copper axe behind, which doesn't make sense, as it was extremely expensive in this time. It was a high-tech tool and weapon. But even for that, there are maybe simple answers, like that the murderers could have been identified by the tribe if they had taken his personal items. Whoever killed him had a serious reason to track him down in that difficult terrain, and to keep up with his escape. But it wasn't about money in the way of a robbery to get the valuable items from him. Probably it was a conflict with his own men in the hunting party that set out to hunt some animals. The 169th victim of the Oklahoma City bombing, they found an additional leg in the rubble. DNA tests showed it belonged to another victim, who had already been buried but with the wrong leg. The wrong leg had already been embalmed, so they could not get DNA at the time. So who did this leg belong to? All other legs had been accounted for in other victims. They found no other body parts, and nobody else had been reported missing. It was only until 2015 they could get DNA from the leg, but it's still classified as a John Doe. A few conspiracy theories had popped up, like maybe a second bomber that got caught in the blast, but it's still unknown. This is honestly one of the most creepiest still unsolved mysteries. The Hinterkaifeck murders happened in 1922 in a farming hamlet in Bavaria, Germany. On one farm, 6 family members were murdered, most likely one by one in a barn by someone who may have been living in the walls of the house or maybe in an attic. Nobody is quite sure. A former employee who left the job I think a day before the murder said she would notice things that didn't seem right, and she had a bad feeling about the place. Aaron Manx Lore covered this in the first season podcast, and the story made it to the first season of the TV series on Amazon Prime. Totally worth the 30 minutes or so. Mystery, creepiness 10/10. On Thursday, December the 12th, 1985, a toddler was spotted wandering unaccompanied around a Kmart department store in Spanaway, Washington, with no parent or guardian in sight. When authorities tried to coax information out of her to help locate her parents, the only piece of information she was able to give was, "Mommy is in the trees." A photo was placed in the local newspaper, and the toddler was soon recognized as Crystal by her maternal grandmother Louise Conrad, who took her into her care, later saying that Crystal appeared shaken and disturbed, perhaps by something she had seen. So where was Mommy? About 2 months later, the body of Diana Robertson, Crystal's mommy, was discovered deep in the forest around Elbe, Washington, with 17 stab wounds and a tube sock tied around her neck. Nearby, an abandoned 1982 Plymouth pickup truck was discovered covered in blood stains, and with a handwritten note on the dashboard simply saying, "I love you, Diana." This truck belonged to her partner, Mike Reamer, an outdoorsman and trapper, who often spent time in these woods. Mike, however, was nowhere to be found. Initially, the police believed him to be responsible for Diana's murder. Just 2 months prior, on October the 19th, 1985, Mike had been arrested and cited for domestic assault and malicious damage after allegedly kicking in a door at her apartment, throwing her to the floor, and rubbing her face in the carpet. They also connected her murder to a double murder that had occurred in the same woods 4 months earlier. A man named Stephen Harkins was found shot to death in his sleeping bag, while his companion, Ruth Cooper, was found strangled 2 months later. Both had a tube sock tied around their neck. So was Mike a serial killer? He had apparently been in the woods at the very time that Harkins and Cooper were murdered, and certainly knew how to navigate the tricky terrain. But with no trace of him, there was no way to tell for certain. Over 20 years later, on March the 26th, 2011, a hiker discovered a partial human skull in the woods off of State Route 7 in Lewis County near Mineral, Washington, about a mile from where Diana's body had been found. Subsequent analysis revealed that it was indeed Mike, and that he was a likely homicide victim himself. So 4 murders in the same woods by an unknown assailant. The question remains, how did Crystal find herself wandering around the Kmart over 30 miles away? She must have been driven there and dropped off, presumably by the serial killer. Crystal must have spent a silent 45-minute drive in the car with the very person who killed her parents. Houston TX Lovers Lane murders. During the summer of 1990, 22-year-old Cheryl Henry met 21-year-old Andy Atkinson through friends at Yucatan Liquor. Andy was home for the summer from Stephen F. Austin State University and the two started dating. On August the 22nd, 1990, the two, who had been dating now for around 2 weeks, had planned a double date with Trill's younger sister Shane. Each couple went their separate ways to continue the night. Shane said she kissed her sister goodnight and told her, "I love you," around 11:30 p.m. It was what they always did. But when Shane woke up in the morning, Cheryl still wasn't home. And over at Andy's house, he also hadn't returned home. Both families contacted the police. A search was conducted for the couple and for the car they were in, Andy's white Honda Civic. In the early evening of August the 23rd, Houston police located Andy's car after a guard, who was doing a sweep of an industrial area, called it in. It was parked in an isolated cul-de-sac on Enclave Road, an area often used as a lover's lane. When police approached the car, it was clear something awful had happened. The windows were rolled down. The key was still in the ignition. The seats were laid back and a cassette was in the dash. On the floorboard of the passenger side was a woman's shoes and purse. But most chillingly, there were fresh signs of blood in the car. Just before midnight, the dogs led police to an area roughly 200 yards from Andy's car. A golf club and 3 golf balls seemed to have been purposefully placed, pointing to pieces of a rotting cedar fence on the ground. Police looked under the pieces of fence and found the body of Cheryl. She was face down. Her clothes had been cut off and tossed near her remains. Her hands were bound behind her back with hemp rope. She had been sexually assaulted and her throat was slashed with 3 gashes. Near her body was also a $20 bill. The search continued for Andy. The next morning, about 100 yards from Trill's body in the tree line, authorities discovered Andy's body. He was fully clothed with his back against a tree and his hands bound, like Trill's. And like Cheryl, his throat had also been slashed, but the slash was so deep he was nearly decapitated. His watch and money were still on his person, ruling out the possibility of robbery as the primary motive. After 32 years, this mystery is still unsolved. March the 19th, 2020. Late that night into the early morning hours of the 20th, police find husband Eric's car crashed and abandoned mid-span of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. When they inform Eric of this, he says Gwen is home in bed. Next morning, Eric posts a doorbell camera video on Facebook. Gwen is missing. This is when she was last seen, and what she was wearing. The video was time-stamped prior to the police visit, so there's already inconsistencies. The afternoon of the 20th, a Quaker find her body in the Puget Sound. The medical examiner rules it a suicide. However, the me who conducted her autopsy was a lame duck. He had already tendered his resignation for cutting corners on numerous investigations, including hastily ruling deaths as suicides, when police believed them to be accidents. Like a month later, Eric remarries. A year later, he moves to his wife's home country in Africa, abandoning his and Gwen's 2 young children with their grandparents. Also, Eric had a long history of abusing Gwen. She was certainly vulnerable to suicidal ideations. Aside from the domestic violence, she was also abused as a child. However, close friends and family describe behavior from her that is not at all consistent with suicidal plans, such as expressing optimism and planning for the future. There's also evidence she had bank accounts with multiple different banks, which Eric didn't know about until after her death, almost like she was hiding money from him for when she would leave him. It's a wild story and I'm only glossing over it. For whatever reason, this is just one of those stories that really disturbs me and left an impression.